It was a worn-out mitten that started everything. Not the money, not the police report, not the courtroom full of people in expensive suits who couldn't quite look each other in the eye. It was a single child's mitten, pale green with a small bear stitched on the cuff, lying in the snow outside the Rideau Center on a Thursday afternoon in late November. And because 11-year-old Nadia Ose stopped to pick it up. Because she was the kind of child who couldn't walk past something lost without wondering who it belonged to. The next 6 months of her life, and the life of one of the wealthiest men in Ottawa, would never be the same. Nadia had been collecting bottles that afternoon. She did it most days after school, dragging a canvas bag her grandmother had sewn from old flour sacks through the alleyways between Rideau Street and the market, pulling empties from recycling bins before the truck came. It wasn't glamorous work, she knew that. The other kids in her class at Lorne Avenue Public School didn't know she did it, and she intended to keep it that way. But her grandmother's heating bill had gone up again, and her grandmother's hands had gotten so stiff that she could barely open a jar of pickles, let alone work the shifts she used to take at the laundromat on Dalhousie. So Nadia collected bottles. She was good at it. Efficient. She knew which blocks were worth the detour and which ones were mostly windshield washer fluid jugs that didn't count for the deposit. She knew to check behind the pizza place on George Street just after 5, because the lunch rush left a trail. She knew things that an 11-year-old shouldn't have to know, and she knew them well, and she didn't complain about any of it, because her grandmother had taught her that dignity wasn't about what you did. It was about how you did it. The mitten was lying near the base of a concrete planter, half buried in snow that had been kicked up from the sidewalk. She almost didn't see it. But she did, and she picked it up, and that's when she noticed the briefcase. It was sitting beside the planter, like someone had set it down to check their phone and forgotten to pick it back up. Dark brown leather, the old-fashioned kind with brass clasps, the type that looked like it had been bought in a different decade and cared for carefully ever since. There was no one standing near it. No one looking around with that particular panic of a person who's just realized they've left something behind. Nadia looked left, looked right, waited. A woman in a red parka walked past without glancing at it. 2 teenagers with headphones didn't even slow down. A man in a courier uniform jogged by on the other side of the street, shoulders hunched against the wind. She waited 5 more minutes. The briefcase sat there in the snow, absolutely still, and nobody came. She thought about leaving it. She genuinely did. She thought about it the way you think hard about something you already know you're not going to do, turning it over in your mind just to be thorough. There was money in her life that she needed badly. There was a heating bill on the kitchen counter at home, and a prescription her grandmother kept putting off filling because it was $68, and $68 was not nothing. There was a hole in the bottom of Nadia's left boot that she'd been lining with a folded piece of cardboard since October. She picked up the briefcase. It was heavier than she expected. She carried it to the nearest police station, which was on Elgin Street, 23 minutes on foot. She knew this because she'd walked it once before, in grade 4, when she and her grandmother had gone to report that someone had stolen the garden tools from their back shed. The officer then had been kind but distracted. She hoped she'd get someone like that again. Someone who would take it from her quickly, thank her, and let her get back to her bottles before it got dark. The officer at the desk was a young woman with close-cropped hair and a name tag that said "Ceased, Beauregard." "I found this," Nadia said, and set the briefcase on the counter. Constable Beauregard looked at the briefcase, then at Nadia, at the flour sack bag of empties on Nadia's shoulder, at Nadia's boots where a small corner of cardboard was visible at the heel. "Where did you find it, sweetheart?" "Outside the Rideau Center, by the planters near the south entrance. I waited, but nobody came back for it." Beauregard came around the counter and crouched to examine the clasps. She didn't open it right away. There was a protocol for that, apparently, but she could tell by the weight and the way her expression shifted slightly that something significant was inside. "How long did you wait?" "Maybe 6. Did you see who left it?" "No, it was just there." Beauregard stood up and looked at Nadia with an expression that was careful and measured, and underneath both of those things, genuinely surprised. "Can I get your name and your guardian's contact information?" Nadia gave her grandmother's name, Eugenia Ose. The phone number she knew by heart because her grandmother had made her memorize it in kindergarten and quiz her on it, once a month ever since, the way other grandmothers quizzed their grandchildren on times tables. She was home by 5:30. Her grandmother had soup on the stove and didn't ask too many questions, which was one of the many things Nadia loved about her. The briefcase belonged to a man named Harrison Caldwell. Nadia didn't know this until 3 days later, when Constable Beauregard called the house and asked if Nadia and her guardian would be willing to come in. The briefcase's owner had been located and was asking to speak with the person who turned it in. Eugenia Osi sat across from Nadia at the kitchen table and looked at her granddaughter for a long moment. "You don't have to go," she said. "I know, but you want to." Nadia thought about it. "I'm curious," she admitted. Her grandmother made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "That," she said, "has been true since you were 2 years old." Harrison Caldwell was 57. He had the kind of face that had probably been handsome in a conventional way when he was younger, and had since settled into something more interesting. Deeper lines, a certain gravity around the eyes, gray at his temples that looked earned rather than styled. He ran a property development company called Caldwell Group that had put up about a third of the glass and steel towers along the Ottawa River waterfront. This was not information Nadia had before she met him. She looked him up afterward, the way she looked most things up, in the library on her lunch break. He met them at the station on a Tuesday afternoon. He was wearing a coat that Nadia could tell was expensive without being able to say exactly why, and he shook her grandmother's hand first, then hers, with the same degree of seriousness which she noticed. "I owe you a significant debt," he said to Nadia. She wasn't sure what to say to that, so she said, "It wasn't mine to keep." Something moved across his face. It wasn't what she'd said exactly. She could tell the words weren't the thing. It was the way she'd said it, like it was just a fact, like there was no other reasonable conclusion. He looked at Eugenia. "Your granddaughter," he said, "has a very clear sense of things." Eugenia Osi smiled the smile of a woman who has known this for 11 years and is simply pleased someone else has noticed. There was a reward. Harrison Caldwell had brought a check, a real one, with his company's name on the top, and he slid it across the table to Eugenia. Nadia didn't look at the number. She felt that looking at it would somehow spoil something, though she couldn't have explained what. Her grandmother looked at it, and her expression didn't change, which meant it was a significant number, because Eugenia Osi was not a woman who got surprised by small things. "That's very generous," Eugenia said. "It's fair," Harrison said. The briefcase contained documents and materials that would have been very difficult to replace, and more than that. He paused in a way that meant more than that was doing a lot of work in that sentence, carrying something heavy. But he didn't say anything else about it, and Nadia, who had been raised to understand that some silences were not hers to fill, didn't ask. She thought about him on the bus home. Not about the money, though she thought about that too, later, when her grandmother quietly told her that the heating bill was covered and the prescription was filled, and there was enough left to get Nadia proper winter boots, real ones, the kind with actual insulation. She thought about the way he'd paused, the weight in that pause. More than that, she also thought about what she'd noticed when she picked up the briefcase outside the Rideau Center and carried it to the station. It had taken her 23 minutes, and the briefcase had been heavy, and at some point around the corner of Mackenzie Avenue, she'd shifted it to her other hand, and the brass clasp had caught on her sleeve and pulled at the stitching. And while she was readjusting her grip, the clasp had come open slightly, just a centimeter, not enough to see anything, but enough for her to feel the edge of something inside. Paper, thick paper, like the kind of folder that held official documents, and below that, something else, something that crinkled. She hadn't looked. She'd closed the clasp and kept walking, but she'd noticed. Harrison Caldwell did not expect to think about the girl again. He had expected to feel relieved, and he did profoundly, in the way you feel relieved when something catastrophic that almost happened recedes just far enough that you can breathe again. The documents in the briefcase were irreplaceable. That was true. But the other thing, the thing beneath the documents, the thing in the sealed envelope that his brother Terence had put there, without telling him, without asking, without a single word of explanation beyond "I needed somewhere safe." That was the thing that had kept Harrison awake for the 3 days the briefcase was missing. He had not opened the envelope. He had not known it was there until 3 days before he lost the briefcase, when Terence had appeared at his office without an appointment and set the briefcase on Harrison's desk and said the words I needed somewhere safe in the voice of a man who was either in serious trouble or had done something seriously wrong. And Harrison, who had been covering for his younger brother since they were children, had taken the briefcase without asking the questions he should have asked. Now, the briefcase was back. The envelope was still sealed, and Harrison was sitting in his car in the parking garage of his building at 10:30 at night, staring at the steering wheel, understanding for the first time in 57 years what it meant to be truly, irrevocably stuck. Terence had a gambling problem. Harrison had known this for 6 years, had been quietly paying off the debts, quietly reshuffling the accounts, quietly being the older brother who fixed things so that the family name didn't get dragged into it. Their mother was 83 and still sharp, and Harrison intended to protect her from knowing until the situation resolved itself, which it never did, because situations involving Terence never resolved themselves. They only transformed. He opened the envelope on a Wednesday. He wished he hadn't. Inside was a promissory note and a signed statement, both in Terence's handwriting. The note was for $240,000, owed to a man named D. Pellerin. The signed statement, implicated Harrison in the debt, used Harrison's name, claimed Harrison was a co-signatory. He wasn't. He had never signed anything. He had never met D. Pellerin. Harrison sat in his kitchen for 4 hours reading and rereading those 2 pieces of paper, and then he drove to his lawyer's office at 7 in the morning and waited on the steps until someone arrived to open the door. The thing about a small city, Nadia's grandmother liked to say, is that news travels the way cold does. You don't see it coming, but you feel it before you understand what it is. It was Nadia's gym teacher, Ms. Trottier, who mentioned it first. She didn't mean to. She was talking to the vice principal in the hallway outside the gymnasium, the kind of low-voiced conversation adults have when they think children aren't within earshot. But Nadia was tying her shoelace on the bench just inside the door, and she heard the name Caldwell, and she heard the word fraud, and she heard trouble. She didn't say anything. She went home and told her grandmother what she'd heard, not because she wanted to gossip. Eugenia would have ended that immediately, but because she'd been sitting with something uncomfortable since Tuesday, and this felt related. When I was carrying the briefcase, she said, the clasp opened a little. I felt something inside, like a sealed envelope. Her grandmother was quiet. I didn't open it, Nadia said. I felt it. I know you didn't open it, but now I'm thinking about it. Eugenia Osi set down her mug of tea and looked at her granddaughter with the focused attention she gave to things that mattered. What are you thinking? I'm thinking that whatever's in that envelope might be what he's in trouble about, and I'm thinking that he was in trouble before I found the briefcase, not because I found it. She paused, and I don't know if that matters. I just wanted to say it out loud. Her grandmother was quiet for a moment. Then she said, sometimes saying it out loud is the first step to knowing what to do next. Nadia nodded. She finished her homework. She went to bed. In the morning, she asked her grandmother if she still had Constable Beauregard's number. She didn't call Beauregard to report anything, because she didn't have anything to report. She called to ask a question which felt more honest. She asked whether, when a lost item is recovered by police, the contents are logged. They were. Beauregard confirmed. Everything was photographed and catalogued before the item was released. So there would be a record, Nadia said carefully, of what was inside. A pause on the other end of the line. Why are you asking, sweetheart? I'm not sure yet, Nadia said. But I think maybe something wasn't right about the situation, and I want to understand it before I say anything I can't take back. Another pause, longer this time. You're 11, Beauregard said. It wasn't unkind. It was just precise. I know, Nadia said, but I was there. Harrison Caldwell's lawyer was a woman named Priscilla Claire, and she was very good at her job, which meant that her first instinct when she heard the word fraud in connection with her client's name was to get very quiet and very organized and very methodical in exactly that order. She pulled every document. She cross-referenced every signature. She found 3 of them that didn't quite match Harrison's known handwriting, and she hired a forensic document examiner from Toronto who confirmed in a 12-page report that the signatures attributed to Harrison Caldwell on the promissory note and the co-signatory statement were not produced by Harrison Caldwell. They were forgeries. But they were forgeries? Terrence's lawyer, who was not as good as Priscilla St. Clair, advised him to maintain his story. Terrence maintained it with the particular stubbornness of a person who has been telling a particular lie for so long that they've started to believe a version of it. He sat in the first deposition and said, clearly and without apparent discomfort, that Harrison had signed those documents willingly, in his presence, in the autumn of 2 years prior. The forensic document examiner said otherwise. The police report from the Elgin Street station, which included the photograph and catalogue of everything in the briefcase, including the envelope, including the date-stamped record of its contents taken before the briefcase was returned to its owner, said otherwise. The record existed. It couldn't be altered, and it placed the envelope's contents in a preserved state before Harrison had any opportunity to tamper with them, which made it impossible to argue that he'd forged the documents himself to deflect blame. Nadia had not planned this. She had not understood exactly what her instinct was protecting when she walked 23 minutes in the November cold to turn in something that wasn't hers. But the chain of custody had held. The record was clean, and the record, as it turned out, was everything. She found out about the hearing from her grandmother, who had read about it in the Citizen. A civil proceeding, a dispute over contested documents, a family matter that had become a legal one. The Caldwell name was in the headline. Nadia read the article twice, then put the newspaper down and went to do the dishes because she needed something to do with her hands. 3 weeks later, Harrison Caldwell came to their house on Coburg Street. He came on a Saturday morning. He was wearing a regular jacket, the kind that didn't announce itself, and he'd taken the bus, which Nadia found out later, because he mentioned it, matter-of-factly, the way people mention things they don't think are worth hiding. He knocked, and Eugenia opened the door, and he said he hoped he wasn't intruding. And Eugenia said she'd put the kettle on. They sat at the kitchen table, the three of them. "I want to explain what happened," Harrison said. "Not to justify anything. I don't think I handled any of this well. But you deserve to understand what you were in the middle of, even though you didn't know you were in the middle of it." Nadia sat with her hands around a mug of tea and listened. He explained about his brother. He didn't make excuses for Terrence. She noticed that. He described what Terrence had done with a plainness that cost him something, she could tell, because the plainness was the hard part. It was easy to dress a difficult thing up in soft language. It was much harder to just say it out clearly and let it sit there. He explained about the envelope, about opening it, about the signatures. The police record, he said, was what made it possible to prove the documents hadn't been altered after the briefcase was recovered. If no one had turned it in, if it had been opened and passed around or the envelope had been disturbed, the chain of custody would have broken. Terrence's lawyer would have been able to claim the contents couldn't be verified. Nadia thought about the moment on Mackenzie Avenue, the clasp, the crinkle of paper, her fingers closing the latch back up. "I didn't know any of that," she said. "I know you didn't." He looked at her steadily. "That's rather the point. What happened to Terrence Caldwell was not a happy ending. Nadia was old enough to understand that not every thread in a story resolved into something clean. He faced a civil suit and a fraud investigation, and a very long period of consequences that would restructure his life in ways that were uncomfortable and probably necessary. Harrison didn't stop being his brother, but he stopped covering for him, which was, Priscilla St. Clair told him privately, the kindest thing he could have done, for Terrence and for himself. What happened to Harrison Caldwell was something he hadn't anticipated feeling at 57, a kind of clarity. He had spent years managing the company, managing the family, managing the particular exhaustion of being the person other people leaned on, without asking first. The briefcase in the snow had cracked something open, and the crack, as it turned out, was where he could see out again. He asked Eugenia, very formally, over a second cup of tea, whether she would be open to discussing Nadia's education. Eugenia looked at him. "I'm not trying to take anything from you," he said quickly. "I'm not suggesting anything inappropriate. Your granddaughter is remarkable, and I'd like to help if that's something you'd consider." Eugenia was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Nadia makes her own decisions. They both looked at Nadia. Nadia thought about it seriously, which was how she thought about everything. She thought about the library at lunch, and the flour sack bag, and the $43 she'd made in November in deposits, and how that had felt like enough, and also, honestly, not enough. She thought about her grandmother's hands, stiff in the mornings. She thought about the way Harrison had said the kindest thing he could have done, about his brother, but also, somehow, about the cost of doing things right when it was inconvenient. "What kind of help?" she asked. He told her. A bursary, already established, for students showing academic promise at schools across Ottawa. Not named for his family, he'd decided that in the car on the way over, because something that had been done quietly deserved to stay quiet. Just a fund, a resource, a door left open. "You wouldn't be the only one," he said. "I'd just be making sure you knew the door was there." She looked at her grandmother. Eugenia picked up her tea. "It's your door, child." That winter was the coldest one in Nadia's memory, which wasn't a very long memory yet, but felt long enough. She got new boots. The reward had covered that in November, proper ones with real wool lining that didn't let the cold in. She wore them on the bus to school, and on the walk to the library, and on the Saturday mornings when she still collected bottles, because she saw no reason to stop. She liked the work. It was honest, and she was good at it, and there was a particular satisfaction in a canvas bag that clinked. Her grandmother's hands got better with the new medication. Not all the way better, that wasn't on offer, but well enough to open jars and hold a cup without wincing, and that felt like a very significant thing. Nadia got into the arts and science program at Lisgar the following September. She took the bus on the first day and found a seat near the window and watched the city pass. In a way she'd never quite watched it before. The towers along the river, the construction cranes, the old limestone buildings going gray in the autumn light. A city that had been built in pieces by people who mostly didn't know each other. Standing up anyway. She never told anyone at school about the briefcase. Not because she was embarrassed, she wasn't, but because it felt like the kind of thing that belonged to the people who'd been there, in the cold, in the station, at the kitchen table. The people who'd made it mean something by doing the unremarkable thing of simply telling the truth. Some stories are like that. They don't need to be told. They just need to have happened, and it had.